Hi, Mystery Writers. It's Mystery Fix. I'm Zara Altair, and this is where we talk about writing a great mystery. And today I want to talk about the do's and the don'ts of writing the first chapter, because the first chapter is your first impression with your readers, and it's so important. And writing a mystery is a long run to the finish, and your first chapter brings the reader into the world of the story and introduces your sleuth. That's the job of the first chapter. Getting your reader into the story and introducing your sleuth. As a writer, you're in for a marathon of writing, and you'll introduce suspects and clues and red herrings and misdirect your sleuth and your reader. But when a reader starts your mystery, they feel they have an unspoken agreement with you to give them a good puzzle and an intriguing and sympathetic sleuth. So your job in the first chapter is to bring the reader into your story. So let's talk about some basic elements of the first chapter, because you define the course of the story in the opening sequences. And this is your story's first impression. I want to mention that again, because if your reader doesn't get past the first chapter, they're not going to read the rest. So the beginning starts the reader on a course to the conclusion, and you want to point the first seeds so they can grow as the story progresses. So you don't want to load up that first chapter with a lot of details. You just want to plant the seeds. So the first sentence, I know all writers hear a lot about the first sentence. You want to hook the reader with a thought or action that puts them into the story. That's the deal. Put them into the story. And the hook doesn't have to be big, and it doesn't need to reveal the murder that's going to be solved in your mystery. It just needs to get the reader to keep going. And while you write your first draft, don't struggle too much with that epic, memorable line just to get the reader into the story. You have the rest of your story and the editing process to refine that first sentence. For now, your goal is to plunge the reader into the story. And writer Jacob Apple says an opening line should have a distinctive voice, a point of view, a rudimentary plot, and some hint of characterization. So that's all you need. You're starting with hints right now. So then when you get past that first sentence to the first paragraph, you want to introduce the setting and the conflict. You want to ground the reader with the place and the time of the story. So is it Los Angeles today, Victorian New York, Rome under Claudius, Lowtown in a land of sorcery? Just let your reader know where they are in the world and some kind of hint of the time. Then as you expand to the first page, you introduce your sleuth and give him a reaction to the little conflict you just mentioned at the beginning of the story. It's the best way to start a story, especially a mystery, is some little conflict that doesn't have to be big. And then on that first page, as you're introducing your sleuth, you want to demonstrate one of your sleuth skills or shortcomings to give your reader a sense of who the sleuth is and how they act in the world. And that's how they're reacting to this little conflict that's come up. So let's take a look beyond the first page, what you want in the first chapter. You want to introduce your sleuth by showing her in everyday world. And that doesn't mean what they have for breakfast, but how they work in their world. What is the context? How do they deal with other people? How are they relating to this little conflict that's come up? Um, you want to show who they see in their world. If there's a sidekick, the sidekick often appears in that very first chapter. Mainly, you want to show how they respond to conflict and create a resolution. So, each scene is a mini story, and that's what you want, a beginning, a middle, and an end with conflict in the middle. So that's what you want in that first chapter. You want to get your reader acquainted with your sleuth, their personality, and the way they display their traits and respond to other people. You're planting a seed of how the sleuth will approach the murder and suspects later in the story. For now, you just want to introduce your reader to your sleuth. And then the tone of your story. Is your story lighthearted all the way through? Is it serious? Is it dark? Uh, you want to establish the tone of the story because, once again, in the beginning, you're making an agreement with your reader that what they get in this first chapter is kind of the essence and the feel of the entire story. So you want to make certain your tone matches the tone of your story, and keep that agreement with your reader from the get-go. You're inviting them into the story. You're making an agreement with them that this is the world, this is the sleuth they're going to work with and follow for the rest of the story. So make it interesting and give them something to chew on, a little conflict and how your sleuth reacts to it. And then later on, revisit that first chapter once you've reached the end. Because things change as you write your novel. And then you can go back and work on that opening sentence, that really important opening sentence that gets your reader into the story, and make sure that the minor conflict in that first chapter hints at the big mystery to come. But really, your first requirement is to bring the reader into the story. You introduce the world, you introduce the sleuth, and you add conflict that challenges your sleuth. Now, there are lots of mistakes that can happen in a first chapter, and I want to touch on some of those first chapter don'ts, because they're usually a signal that you're a beginning writer. So, you want to keep your first chapter lean and stay with the story. The first-time novelists often tell too much in that first chapter. They know so much and they want to share everything. You've got the whole rest of your story to share all those details. The job of that first chapter is to get your reader into the story. So let's take a look at some of these mistakes to keep focused on your story moving forward in the first chapter. One of the big ones is starting the story too early. Your reader wants the story. So introduce your sleuth doing something with an action. Give your reader some action. Waking up, taking a shower, eating breakfast, all of those things are not actions. And they really don't reveal a lot about your character. So leave them out. And if your sleuth morning ritual is essential to the story, then show it later. For now, you want to jump into the story and jump into action. Okay, and the next thing is let's say the whole life is revealed. Oh, my phone is ringing. There. The whole life revealed, and it's called Backstory. And your readers don't need to know right away the major childhood trauma or where your sleuth grew up. Those details, you can sprinkle them throughout your story later, but we don't need them in the first chapter. And you can start adding backstory in the first part of Act 2. That's by the time you get to Act 2, the reader's well into the story. They know the sleuth. They know how the sleuth works. And so you can start adding some of those details. Now your main job in that first chapter is just to pull the reader into the story. And you pull them in with action. You pull them in with how your sleuth responds to situations. I don't pull them in with long descriptions. So that's my next don't. Long descriptions in the first chapter. So long descriptions about what your sleuth is wearing, long descriptions about the setting, um, any kind of long narrative passages. A whole paragraph in the first chapter is a long narrative descriptive passage. So sprinkle the details in that first chapter and leave the long descriptions for later in the story. Because once again, you want to get the reader into the story before you add descriptive passages. You can highlight a physical detail of your sleuth, but not a whole long, head to toe thing. And you can sprinkle all those details about your sleuth later on. All right. Okay, here's another major one that you don't want to do, and that is your main protagonist, the sleuth, looking in the mirror. Just don't do it. Don't even think about it, all right? This method is so overused. An easier way to do that, and more interesting, is to let other characters respond to your sleuth's traits and their physical details. Um, if your sleuth has a disability, you can certainly show the reader in the context of the story, because remember, this whole first chapter is about the story and getting the reader involved in the story. One more that beginning writers use because they think it's a hook, it's a false hook, and that's they start off with what I call a gratuitous sex scene. Sex is not a hook. And remember, you're making an agreement with your reader to set the tone and to get them involved in a mystery. If you just start with a sex scene to get the reader reading that first page or so, you're breaking your agreement before you even start. So don't do the gratuitous sex scene. It's not necessary. One more thing, and that is mysteries are a genre, and we talk about that a lot. And you don't need to be artsy. You just don't need to be artsy in your first chapter. So leave the hinted language that tells about an orange on the table, highlighting your descriptive genius. We don't need all that at the beginning. Get to the story. All right, I think I've said that enough now. So just make sure your first chapter focuses on the story and you'll avoid these mistakes. So your best guideline is your story. If you've done your planning, you know who's in the first chapter, you know what actions occur, and you know what the minor conflict is. So focus on those things, make the story move, and you'll accomplish your goal in the first chapter. because you have an entire novel to spread out details and narrative description and backstory. The first chapter is your reader's first impression of your mystery. So make it a good impression and then work hard to keep them reading. Okay, that's it. Do's and don'ts of the first chapter. Thank you so much for being here. And as always, ask questions. And if you like these little hints on mystery writing, be sure to support me on Patreon. It's really simple. Your micropayments help support keeping these videos going. And I will see you next time with more hints about writing mysteries.